When you've never really taken a chance to show people who you are and how you move through the world, where do you start? How do you begin? And what are the first steps you take? What does vulnerability in real time even mean? And what does it look like? Hi, welcome to another episode of Business Mindset Mastery. My name's Heather Gray. I'm a mindset coach and I work with business owners, leaders, and entrepreneurs over at choosetohaveitall.com. And today we're responding to a listener question about vulnerability, about showing up, showing people who you are, and letting them see the real you, warts and all. What does that look like, and what does it mean, and how do you begin? Here's her question. Heather, I just discovered your show over the holidays at a friend's recommendation. She mentioned that you like Brené Brown too and thought I might like your show. I'm not a business owner, just a stay-at-home mom here, but I do have a question. It's okay if it's not relevant for your show, but I thought I would try. Heather, I'm blown away by how real you are. You don't just tell it like it is, but you tell countless strangers how it really is for you. I've listened to your episode about leaving your family and friends twice now. I just can't get over how willing you are to just share who you are. Heather, I'm lonely in my life. I don't have a lot of friends, and I have a sneaky suspicion that it's because I don't share. I don't tell people what's going on for me. I have two best friends, and only one of them knows that I grew up with an abusive dad. I am closest and most connected with my kids. It's easier with them. Even my husband. I know he wishes I were more open with him, but I have no clue how. I don't even think I know what that means. I just have a vague sensation that I should be doing more or doing something differently. How are you doing it, Heather? How do you tell people the most embarrassing details of your life? And maybe I need to start, but I have no clue how. Can you help me try? Thank you so much for joining in on the show and listening and taking in the things that I have to say. And I appreciate that you're listening in even though you don't own a business or have the goal to own a business. I think it's really important and really a compliment actually to me. So thank you for that. But the first thing that I want to let you know is that it wasn't always like this for me. I didn't sort of come out of the womb sort of immediately telling everybody my whole life. And when I did at the beginning, I started as a kid sharing a lot about myself and my business and not, my business ownership, but who I was. I was doing it in a way to get attention. I was doing it in a dysfunctional pattern to get people to engage with me. So my personal challenge over time was, how do I use story to connect and not just story for attention or story for drama's sake? So I don't want you to think that this was easy. We all have our journeys, we all have our personal experiences, and we all have our moments of recognizing that we need and want more connection. And that's what I'm really hearing from you in this letter, that you're lonely, you see that other people have more connections, you're disconnected from your own life, and you can see that you're maybe disconnected in your marriage, and you have no idea where to begin. I really understand that. And I understand the bravery it must have taken, and I respect it that you wrote to me and you reached out for my 2 cents. But before you start connecting to other people, we got to get you connecting to yourself, to be aware of how you got here. How did you get this far, this disconnected? And what's your motivation for change? What needs to be different? Because you get to choose the pace at which you do this. You get to choose the timing. You get to say when, and you get to say how much. And you're not going to be able to decide that for yourself until you get connected to yourself. So that's the first step. Vulnerability starts with you. So take a moment, take a deep breath. We're going to have a quick break, and I'm going to find you right on the other side. The first thing that stands out to me is that your friend sent you my way because of our mutual admiration for Brené Brown. So that means you're already thinking about vulnerability. You're already thinking about showing up. You've already identified for yourself that you need to move through the world differently because the way you've been moving through the world isn't working for you. You're already learning how to be different. So I want you to recognize that you've already begun this process of reflecting, observing, and connecting. The next thing that really stands out to me here is the thing that you mentioned as an aside, that you grew up in a home with an abusive dad. I don't know if that's your only experience in your life of a loved one, of somebody who's important, not taking care of you in the way that they should. I don't know if this is your only example of trust being disrespected, of feeling unsafe, of feeling unloved, of feeling hurt and abandoned by the people who were supposed to take care of you. This may be your only example, but this may have been a pattern of experiences that you've had in your own life where life has kind of taught you that you can't show up, that you can't share who you are, that there's risk and danger involved in doing so. It's easy when people are disconnected from their emotional experiences or disconnected from their relationships to think that they're in somehow or some way broken. I don't want you to start with that story about yourself. It is a normal reaction after having grown up in an abusive home to struggle with trust. You are having a normal reaction to your personal experience and history. You are not broken. You are not damaged. You didn't learn how to trust or connect in a healthy way, so you disconnected in an act of self-preservation. I want you to see that as your own ability to protect yourself from danger and risk. I want you to look at that as a sign that you're capable of taking care of yourself and you're capable of guarding your own gate. And what I mean with that is when we talk about being vulnerable with other people, you can't just be vulnerable with everyone out of the gate. And you used my example of the podcast, and I don't think that's actually a fair descriptor or comparison. And the reason for that is I'm basically I know that there are people I know listening to the show, but I'm also telling a pile of strangers my business. And I would argue that it's easier to tell a pile of strangers our business than to tell our very best friends. So I want you to cut yourself some slack, to not use the measuring stick of comparing yourself to me in that I share my business on a public platform and you should at least be able to tell your best friend, because those two things are apples and oranges. A lot of people, not to quote Jack Nicholson here, but they can't handle the truth. And I don't know if you've had an experience in the past of trying to talk about your abuse, but having that awkward response in response to you sharing. It's really hard for some people to hear that. And when you have a foundation in your core and in your upbringing that's hard to talk about, it starts to build an automatic censor in how you grow up and how you present yourself to the world. Part of what you're struggling with is you practically have a body memory, an ingrained habit of not sharing, of making yourself small, of hiding into the woodwork, of putting the focus onto other people and not yourself. And now after years and years of doing that, you're ready to kind of open up the mask a little bit, show who you really are, and start to represent yourself as you are today. That is a really big, intimidating task, but it is absolutely possible. The first thing you need to recognize, though, is you are at the gate and you get to decide who you do that for, who's worth it and who's not. You've already decided that your kids are worth it. You've gotten married, so you've at least connected enough with your husband and shown enough of who you are to connect with him, and you've made good friends. If you can keep that in mind, you get to control what's next. You don't mention in your letter whether or not you ever got counseling or therapy or coaching around your childhood, whether or not you've talked to a trained professional about how you grew up and your experiences growing up. But if you haven't done that, it's worth considering. I've talked to tons of adults who have grown up in difficult childhoods and they never had to get professional help to organize their thinking or come to gain insight about their experiences. And you might not either. So that's going to be a personal choice up to you. I just need to put it on the table because sometimes looking at our past can be painful and can bring up things that we're not capable of organizing or understanding on our own. And that's where a trained professional can really help. And if you need some help finding somebody, just reach back out to me. And I have some ways that I could help you do that. But that being said, the first thing you want to do is understand for yourself how you got here. To recognize that you didn't get the parenting you deserved. You didn't get the lessons on building healthy relationships in the way that you should have. Instead, you learned how to build unhealthy relationships. And my guess is you've reverse engineered the whole thing so that you can be a better parent to your kids than your dad was to you. And that's a really powerful place to start. To remind yourself that you're capable of making connection and now you're ready for more. Perhaps having kids changed you. Perhaps getting married has changed you. And bit by bit, you're becoming more and more open to the idea of showing up in your own life, showing people who you are. People always ask me where to begin because I think it's really easy to identify a problem of, oh yeah, I have a problem with vulnerability. But once you identify that, where the heck do you start? The first thing that I usually ask people to think about in terms of starting, in terms of showing up in the world differently, is where have you been censoring yourself? So many times, if we think about you being at the gate, you've closed the gate to the point where nothing has gotten out, but you have probably stopped and thought at least a couple of times a week about an example in your own life that reminded you of something that someone else said and you chose not to share it. You had a thought and an idea and you didn't say it. You had a point of view and you didn't offer it. You had a question and you didn't ask it. So many times when we're trying to be vulnerable in that beginning time, the easiest way to do it is to look at where we've already censored ourselves, because it's at that censor point where you're identifying your natural inclination to share. And some of us have a censor where we're going to give all the dirt, we're going to give all the dirty bits, all the details, and we're not going to think anything of it. And some people are going to barely share anything. But that moment of pause and consideration is usually our natural line around sharing. And when you're starting with vulnerability, I would start there, at your natural instinct that you're already curbing and cutting off at the pass. That's going to be the easiest place for you to begin. And I want you to take a look at, and maybe even start to journal or write down or tap into your phone, times where you thought about saying something and you didn't. Times you thought about reaching out, but you didn't. A phone call you wanted to return, but you didn't. If you look at the times you've cut off connection, or you've minimized connection, or you've closed the door to a relationship growing, my guess is that's where you're going to find where your vulnerability begins. And before you just up and make a change and go and do something differently, I want you to go through a self-examination process. What about those moments is making you nervous? What about those times has you second guessing? What is your instinct to stop all about? Because the first thing you want to do, absolutely, is make sure that this is a risk worth taking and that you're battling the pros and cons, because not everybody and not every situation is going to deserve your vulnerability. In these instances, I really like to coach people to the idea of choosing who you're going to be more vulnerable with. It's really intimidating and overwhelming to think to yourself, I'm just going to be more vulnerable with everyone. I'm going to be more authentic, more honest with everybody in the world. Or as I go grocery shopping, when I go to the post office, and when I pick up my dry cleaning. Because that's just too much. When you've lived a life on a sensor, you have to remove that sensor slowly and carefully. You have to protect yourself and your spirit a little bit. You've identified in your letter that you already seem to do that fairly easily with your kids, but you'd like to do that more with your best friend and more with your husband. That's where I would start. I would look at the places where you've closed off, you've censored yourself, you've played small in your important relationships, and I would start there. I would look at ways that you could connect more, stories about your day you could share, thoughts that you've had, things that you've come to care about, opinions that have resonated with you, but start conversation. Talk to them and be transparent and say, listen, I'm starting to connect things about my past and I'm realizing that they're affecting our present day and my ability to participate as wholly as I want to in this relationship. And I want you to know that I'm going to make some changes. This is where it's hard. This is where it hurts. And this is where I start to get really excited. I think it's also important to reflect for yourself what you're hoping to get out of the deal. If you're hoping for more connection, if you're hoping for deeper, more connected relationships, I think you need to tell that to your people. So to be clear with your friends and husband to say, and I'm hoping by doing so that we'll feel more connected. I've been feeling lonely and disconnected, and I think that's because I'm not showing up. I'm not sharing who I am. I'm not being honest about my experience, and I would really like to start. The other thing that you can start to do is start to ask questions. Some people who avoid vulnerability ask a shit ton of questions because they like putting the focus on other people. It keeps the focus off themselves. And I get that. But one of the other things I see a lot when people are hesitant to be vulnerable is they don't ask questions and they don't express curiosity about other people or other people's experiences because they don't want that spotlight to then up and turn on them. So they keep quiet and they just keep conversations generic and on the surface. If you want to go deep, if you want to really get to know people and allow people to get to know you, to connect on the human experience, you can start by asking questions. And when you hear your friend's response or your husband's response, don't just listen, but offer reciprocity. Let them know that you've heard them and validate their experience. But then maybe this is where you take a chance and you reflect for yourself in the ways that you resonate with their ideas or how your experience has been different. And start to connect to your human experience in real time, to connect with them on theirs, on ways that you're alike and ways that you're different. It starts with conversation. You mentioned in your letter that one of the reasons why you connected with me is because I shared the story of my move and leaving family and friends. I want to share another story or two with you about that time that may help you understand this. I think sometimes when we're talking about really, not to use the word, but vulnerable topics and tough and things that are hard to understand and talk about, it's easier sometimes to have the conversation when we're talking about someone else rather than ourselves. So I want to use this example of myself as a way of helping you understand how you might do this for yourself. Not as a way to say, hey, look, vulnerability is so easy, watch me do it. I just want you to see the process through which I went through it so that maybe it'll help you identify how you can do it yourself. And the theme that I want you to pay attention for is offering and accepting help. that's kind of the lesson and the skill set around vulnerability that I want you to grab onto right now. Because you see, when I did that move, I was Miss Independent with a capital I. I took care of all the details. I connected with the realtor. I made sure that what we needed to keep in the house for the stager stayed, and we got rid of everything else. And my husband and I had already decided we were going to get rid of all the furniture and the big equipment in the house. We weren't going to be keeping very much. We had maybe about 20 boxes total, and then the only thing we had in addition to that was his adaptive ski. He has a hand cycle and he has 2 backup wheelchairs. So those were the main things that were going to be going into our pod storage unit. And the idea is that the pod would come to the house, I would load it, and then it would be off to California until we got there. And I picked a Wednesday for the pod to come, mostly because it was the most convenient day for me. I didn't have any client calls scheduled, and I didn't really think it was going to be that big of a job. And when the pod showed up at the house, it was one of the loneliest moments of my life, realizing that I was basically moving out of my house by myself. My husband was at work. I hadn't asked any friends to help because, again, logistically, it didn't seem like that big of a job. It didn't look like I was going to need that much help. But it was incredibly lonely to pack up a life and do it by myself. And the whole time, I just clued into the loneliness. And there were moments when I was in the elevator going up and down between floors, and I was just crying to myself. And nobody really knew because it was a monster of my own making. This wasn't anything that people wouldn't have helped me with if I had asked. I could have gotten a whole army of people. It hadn't occurred to me that I wouldn't want to do it by myself. But because I hadn't asked, I told myself a story that I didn't get to ask. And I did the entire day by myself, and I was crying through most of it, which, as I say it out loud, sounds really pathetic, but it's open and honest that I was just largely by myself doing it. And it wasn't until it was done and the lock was on the pod, ready to be shipped back, that I realized it didn't have to be that way. I easily could have reached out and been like, I thought I had it, but I clearly don't. Or does somebody want to come and just walk with me while I bring these boxes up and down? Like, is there anybody else who would like to just hang out, keep me company? And I kept quiet on it because I guess I was embarrassed and I didn't want to be a bother at that point. And I really saw it as something that I had made the mistake on, that people would have shown up if I had given them notice, but I didn't deserve to give, get last minute attention on it, I guess. I don't know. But I remember that entire day being wrapped up in vulnerability. And it wasn't until it was over that I realized all I had to do was ask for help. All I had to do was say, hey, thought I had it, clearly don't, and an army would have shown up. I want you to think a little bit about that for a second and see if there's times in your own life where you've been lonely unnecessarily simply because you were afraid to ask for help. The second loneliest day in this process was my last day in the condo. The day when all the last bits needed to be packed in my car. Anything that we wouldn't need until we moved into our final destination was packed in the pod, and everything left was going to be what we were going to need for our remaining time in New England, and then what we would need for the first month or two in California. So there was still a lot of packing to do. And again, I thought pretty much I had it covered and I could do it on my own. Honestly, I underestimated how much work was involved that day. But I remembered the lesson that I had learned on pod day was you got lonely, you cried your way through it, and you didn't have to. So really early into that day, I reached out to 2 friends, and I've talked to you on the show that I use the Voxer app for work, where it's a walkie-talkie app that lets you talk to people in real time. So I reached out to 2 friends of mine, Heather and Amy. You guys get the shout out. I know you listen to the show, But I knew that I didn't want any of my friends in New England to be involved that day, because then I would have either had to be strong for them or take care of their own sadness watching me pack out the remaining stuff from my house. I just knew I didn't want to take care of anybody, and I needed to be taken care of. My husband was at work, so I just used Voxer, and I talked to Heather and Amy, and I said, I'm having a really lonely day. I'm all by myself. I just have some last minute packing to be done, and then a huge chunk of this project is done, and we'll finally be out of the condo and we can get it ready to sell. But again, I'm doing it by myself and I'm lonely. And I just put myself out there completely transparently, and they showed up in spades. And all day, through every single trip, up and down again, into my car, out of my car, into the storage unit, out of the storage unit, and everything in between, they kept me company, and they bantered with me, and they talked with me, and they encouraged me. And when I yelled, I'm done, into their Voxer, they celebrated with me, and they saw how hard I worked, recognized and validated my efforts, and were absolutely there, even though one lives in Canada and the other lives in Chicago. I had the support of people because I said out loud, I need help, I need company. I think sometimes people get lonely in their own lives because they don't do that. And when I look back now on that Friday, it's no longer the loneliest day. It's the day that two really cool friends of mine kept me company thanks to technology, but also thanks to me, because I was vulnerable and I asked. I hear the loneliness in your letter, and I'm wondering about it. I'm wondering how many times you've needed a helping hand, but you haven't asked for it. I'm wondering how many times people have offered helping hands to you and you haven't accepted it. Vulnerability isn't just about talking, isn't about just spilling your guts and sharing your dirty bits and being raw and deep all the time. Vulnerability is also allowing yourself to lean. It's also about allowing yourself to be supported, taken care of, loved, nurtured, and respected. How often do you turn those things away? Because sometimes children who've grown up in abusive households and become adults have a really hard time accepting love. Their story is that they don't deserve it. Their experience is that it comes with a price, that if they get used to it, it's something that'll just go away and that it's not theirs to have or to own. So rather than get used to it, they don't allow themselves to have it. If you're finding conversation really hard, that's okay. You don't need to start there. You can start with accepting help. You can start with saying yes to somebody who wants to show up for you and who wants to be there for you. Lastly, I want to talk to you specifically about your husband, because I agree with you. If you're sensing something, something's probably already there, and I know you're totally capable of managing it. The easiest way to do this, I think, would just to be transparent about the fact that you are identifying this for yourself, that you have this sensation that you could do a better job connecting to him, that his needs might be going unmet, and that might be because you don't even know what his needs are, but that you really would like to. I think you just have to say it out loud. You might find that you're imagining that this is worse than it is. I think a lot of people who struggle with vulnerability see themselves as entirely broken, as if it's this black or white thing that they're either whole or they're broken, rather than there's just, cracks in the system that need some repair. So before you imagine how bad it is with your husband, I would get his perspective, and I would allow him to tell you, and I would lean into the idea that you have to trust that he's being honest with you, that if he doesn't tell you things, there's no way you can know, because he needs to be vulnerable in response to you, and he may not be, but that part you don't have any control of. All you can do is reach out to him and say, I get the sense that I could do a better job of connecting with you. I understand that your needs might not be, met, and I want to do a better job, but I don't know if you're unhappy. I don't know what you're unhappy with, but I would really like to start the conversation. If you just open it up, he's going to offer, hopefully, a response that gives you some sort of frame around the problem to let you know how big the problem is or how small it is. But I wouldn't go in this place where a lot of people fall into this trap of self-identifying the problem and then self-deciding the solution, because you can't do this without a conversation with him. It's a vulnerable conversation to have, but you're already sitting in vulnerability. You're creating a story that you're a wife that isn't meeting her husband's needs. You're already in the shit. You might as well choose the path that's going to get you out of it. So if you can think about how you can reach out to him. And if conversation feels too intense, feels too intimate, too vulnerable for you, that's okay. Would you be willing to write him a letter? Would you be willing to just send him an email to say, I've had this on my mind. I want to start a conversation in our marriage about this. I have no idea how. But wherever you feel comfortable beginning, I would begin there, and I would trust that he'll take the lead and will take it from there, because he knows who he married. This isn't this story that you were hugely vulnerable and open and, when you were dating and you first met and then suddenly you became closed off. That's not what happened here. What you're recognizing for yourself is that you've always kind of lived your life a little bit closed and you want to be open now. So I think if you start the conversation, you take away the intimidation factor that your marriage is on the line and you just start talking, I think it'll be easier. And then once you do it with him, then you can try it out on your friends too. And if you really need to, because the marriage talk is too hard and you need to kind of practice with your friends first. What's most important is that you're identifying it for yourself. You're seeing a need to grow and to change, and you're opening yourself up to the possibility of doing so. That is where your strength is. That's where your resiliency is. That's where your bravery is. And that's where you're going to find the courage to be vulnerable. This isn't easy stuff, and we're not going to one and done it in a single podcast, but I hope it gives you a frame. And I hope you certainly do not compare yourself to me and you, because I am years in, I am decades into this personal development journey. So you can't compare my 20th year in personal development with your first. So it's going to be okay. I hope you write back in a little while and tell me how things have turned out and how these conversations have gone. But I really appreciate that you wrote in, and I hope my answer helps. And I hope that you start to have an easier time and you feel more connected in your relationships. Thanks so much for writing to me. I really enjoyed answering you on this one. And if any of you have a question, this show is being built on your questions, so we need them to keep coming in, or else I start talking to you about nonsense. So write to me at heather@choosetohaveitall.com. Some of you, instead of writing in questions, have written in topic requests, and I'm totally on board with that. I'm looking at the topic requests that have come in, trying to organize them a little bit and figure out a little bit of an outline. I know you guys are used to me spitballing my ideas and thoughts, but sometimes on topics I do better with an outline. So I'm going to get those things together, and you'll start hearing those episodes in the next week or two. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll be back in your earbuds tomorrow. Bye for now.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.